Okay, welcome to the first of many lectures involving the various topics of U.S. History 2. Today we're going to take a look at, under the auspices of Commander-in-Chief in wartime, they had uh, the sole right to decide what the country was going to look like immediately after the war. Congress, on the other hand, for numerous reasons, dominated by various what some people classified back then as radical groups, the radical Republicans. Uh, they wanted to take a look at exactly what the relationship was going to be between the conquered territories and the old states. They also, of course, were interested in defining what the civil liberties of the ex-slaves were going to look like. So there was a lot of back and forth. Traditionally, in this country, uh, we're pretty good at making war. We're roughly 11 or 12 and 1, which is a pretty darn good record. So we're good at conducting wars. We're good at winning them. What we're not too good at is, of course, putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. We're not really good at the period after the war. Now, an exception to that would be after World War II, we did a fairly good job in putting Europe back together again under something that we'll talk about much, much later, of course, the Marshall Plan. But outside of that, we struggle. Take a look at the ongoing conflicts in both Afghanistan and in Iraq, uh, the rise of ISIS and Al Qaeda, and the list just goes on and on. So that's something we don't have the patience for. We certainly don't have the expertise, it would seem, and we lose interest very, very quickly once a war is over. We just want the boys home and let's get back to the way things used to be. Problem with the Civil War was, after that war, it was never going to be the way that it used to be. So that was the Civil War. And immediately after that, you now have the area known as Reconstruction. So let's take a look at that time period. After the war, again, we've used the analogy, so we'll continue to use it. We're now dealing with a idea of who and how is the South going to come, whose thumbnail are they going to be under in terms of admittance back into the Union. This was a topic that was discussed all the way through the war. You had South, North, and then Reconstruction. Now, when the war was over, let's go back to the idea that I expressed earlier. Again, the country just wanted to get on with life as it had been. So the idea of reconciling, healing, uh, was tantamount with most people. Not so with the Republicans in Congress. That's why, as the film indicated, uh, Lincoln was attempting to bypass Congress early on because he knew he was not going to get their cooperation. So that's when he issues his 10% plan, which we'll discuss shortly. Now, the other problem, and it was a problem that did not receive much thought early on. Again, keep in mind the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves in those territories which were still, as of January 1st, 1863, involved in the Civil War. So that meant that the border states, which of course had gone with the Union, could keep their slaves. That meant that territories which had already been conquered in Louisiana, in Arkansas, in parts of Tennessee, did not have to give up their slaves because they were not involved in the war anymore. So again, this was not freeing all the slaves, but regardless, 4.5 million people were now no longer chattel, were now freed men. So what do you do with them? What status do they have economically, politically, again, morally? So the question that comes down is the one you see at the bottom of the screen. What did the war mean? And who was going to be the one responsible for answering that question? Early on, I shouldn't say early on, really towards the end of the war, Lincoln proposes and passes the Freedmen's Bureau. This was supposed to help all black and white war refugees, but primarily uh, after General O. Howard, a white general after whom Howard University in Washington, D.C. is named after, uh, he will take over the agency. And it primarily is going to be used to guarantee uh, the economic and political rights of the freedmen. So the questions of Reconstruction are very simple. And it was Lincoln who was taking the lead in answering those questions. Number one, who would rule in the South? If they're back in, and keep in mind, uh, it sounds like, which it was, word games were played during the entire Civil War. During the war, Lincoln never referred to them as the Confederacy. Lincoln refused to bargain with them. Lincoln refused to recognize they existed as a separate entity. They were going to come back into the Union as individual states. And now, who's going to run those states? Was it going to be the people who had fostered this idea of independence in the South, or would it be people different than that? Who's going to run Reconstruction? And that, of course, is Congress, or is it the executive branch? And lastly, what shape would Black rights take? Keep in mind, early on, Lincoln never saw the freedmen as equal. That would change after the Emancipation Proclamation with the influence of Frederick Douglass, the influence of Horace Greeley, and primarily the influence of the almost 200,000 freedmen who participated uh, in the Union Army and Navy. Once Lincoln saw their value, once Lincoln saw how hard they fought, then he started to reconsider the role that blacks would play in the new Union. Uh, and that really goes to Lincoln's credit. And what I say by that is, or what I mean by that, is that Lincoln was evolving. He was not all one way and stayed that way. He was open to ideas. He was open to reassessing what he had believed before. And of course, by the time, unfortunately, of his assassination, he had done a 180, and it was legitimate. It was not a political thing. It was not to gain votes. It was because it was something that he totally believed in. Now, Lincoln's plan, the 10% plan, again, let's go back to his uh, second inaugural address. And in that address, Lincoln says, with malice towards none and charity towards all. With malice toward none. So Lincoln wanted this done quickly so that the process of healing could begin. He wanted to be lenient so that they would be accepted back uh, rather quickly. And above all, he wanted to do it with presidential authority. Again, bypassing Congress, using the powers that he felt were his as a result of his role as commander in chief. So by December of 1863, you had what were called Lincoln governments in Louisiana, Tennessee, and Arkansas. You had state governments that were, I'm going to call them rechartered, under the auspices of Lincoln's plan. Now, what did that plan, the 10% plan, say? Well, essentially, what it said was 10%, just 10% of the voting population had to accept the results of the war, accept the Emancipation Proclamation, and declare loyalty to the Union. Just 10%. He was going to issue presidential pardons to those that had participated in really what you would call this treasonous act. Now, does that mean that everybody was eligible for a pardon? No, it does not. Certain people were automatically denied those pardons. A Jefferson Davis, the Confederacy's one and only president, a Robert E. Lee, for example, uh, and other high-ranking officers and politicians. The rest would have to take an oath of loyalty. And then once taking that oath of loyalty, once that now was 10% of the population, then they could vote on a new constitution within their individual states and be taken back into the Union. Now, what happens following that, as you see, and of course now my battery's running again, so that should be a little bit brighter. That's a lot better than the guy giving this lecture. Anyway, he had said all along, as you see down the bottom of his quote, that they were out of their normal relationship. But once the war was over and they do what he had mentioned above, then they're back in their normal relationship. Well, was Lincoln married to that? As you see right there, he says, no one plan must we stick to, but we must adhere to certain principles. Certain principles. Well, what were those principles? Well, of course, fidelity to the Union and support of the Constitution, acceptance of the Emancipation Proclamation, and the acceptance of the document that he oft times referred to during the course of the war and even prior to it. And that was the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. He would refer to that time and time again. And most eloquently in, of course, his Gettysburg Address. Now, on the other side of this coin, of course, you have the group known as the Radical Republicans. This group wanted to remake the South and remake the United States Constitution. They were led by gentlemen from Pennsylvania, Congressman, House of Representatives Thaddeus Stevens, and United States Senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner. Now, they had put together a committee, if you will, on Reconstruction. That joint committee, shared between the House of Representatives, aka Stevens, and the Senate, aka Sumner, had concluded, as you see at the bottom of the screen, that the states had committed political suicide. So, in other words, they no longer existed as a separate entity. They were not out of their normal relationship. They ceased to exist, and they would have to be totally remade. And that would be done by the United States Congress. That was their power. Stevens, by the way, is an interesting character. I don't know if any of you saw the Academy Award-winning film Lincoln, which starred Daniel Day-Lewis, who won the Academy Award for Best Actor. That was out maybe 5-6 years ago, maybe even longer than that. But Stevens from Pennsylvania had a common law wife who many people thought was his slave, which he was not. He was genuinely in favor of total Black equality, and in his will, he asked to be buried in an all-Black cemetery in Pennsylvania. So Stevens was genuine in his beliefs. As for Sumner, there is some doubt there. I am not one of those that doubt his sincerity. But Sumner, if you remember, was beat to near death on the floor of the United States Senate by a member of the House of Representatives in the late 1850s. And due to the traumatic head injuries that he received, he was out of the Senate for a while. And when he came back, there were some that felt that he wanted vengeance. Now, Congress comes up with its own plan. This is known as the Wade-Davis bill. Now, that's two different people, Benjamin Wade, and Edmund Davis. They came up with something called the Ironclad Oath. They're going to treat the states, the Southern Confederacy, as conquered territories, acting as if they no longer, or I shouldn't say, had never been in the Union. And as conquered territories, they could be dictated to. The Ironclad Oath, well, what that simply said, and there's the lovely picture of Benjamin Wade, what that said in July of 1864 was that 50% of all eligible voters had to take an oath of loyalty. And in that oath of loyalty, it had to say that they never supported nor participated in the Confederacy. Well, considering that 85% of all white males in the South were in the Army at one time or another, and then take the others who participated in the governments that had left the Union, that was a number that was not going to be reached for quite some time. And as you see in number 2, only non-Confederates could vote for the Constitution. Now, start putting all that together. If you do the math, which I'm sure all of you are a lot better at than I am, you'll find that this was impossible for them to secure or to reach the standards that have been set in the Wade-Davis bill. Now, what does that do? That gives the Republicans full control of the South. And it could have meant the death of the Democratic Party down in the South. So it would be an entire generation before these standards could be achieved by anybody or by any state in the South at that point in time. So was this deliberate? Absolutely. All Confederate officers were non-citizens. So they could not participate, obviously, in voting. They could not participate in government. They could not participate at all in the reconstructing of the South. As was said by Thaddeus Stevens, the authority of Congress is paramount and it must be respected. So the battle lines are drawn between the executive branch and Lincoln and the radical Republicans and Congress.
6 months earlier, Abraham Lincoln had been reelected to a second term.
Now, the movie Lincoln, of course, deals almost exclusively with the passage of the 13th Amendment, at least getting it out of Congress. Remember, uh, two-thirds of the congressmen had to accept it, and then two-thirds of the states had to accept it for it to become an amendment. So first it had to get out of Congress. You see the vote, 119 to 56, but it only passes by just 2 votes. So there were a lot of backroom deals made by Lincoln and by Stevens pressuring uh, Republicans and some Democrats to pass the 13th Amendment. It will finally be signed into law in December of 1865. Of course, by that time, unfortunately, Lincoln had been dead for a few months and would not see the fruits of all of his labors. Now, as I said before, you're going to have the passage of the Freedmen's Bureau, March 1865. Social reform through military force. Social reform through military force. And this brings up an interesting question. Can you force somebody to act and believe morally by a law? If I pass a law that you don't support, can I force you to obey that law? Can I force you to change what your moral beliefs are? And that's going to become the question. Because obviously, for almost 200 years, the South had believed quite differently, as did many Northerners, to be quite frank. And the Freedmen's Bureau was going to be the instrument that would attempt to do this. Later on, followed by the United States Army, which we'll get into quite shortly. All of this, however, was going to be put into question when this happens. John Wilkes Booth assassinates Abraham Lincoln on April 14th, 1865. That ends any chance of reconciliation. Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, they all knew that Lincoln was their last best hope of entering back into the Union seamlessly. Of course, it was discovered that there was a plot to assassinate not only Lincoln, but the vice president. There was an attempt on Secretary of State Seward's life. There was a plan to also kill Grant, who they hoped would attend the theater that evening with Lincoln, which of course he did not. So that plot only re-emphasized to those radical Republicans that the South was not going to come back in smoothly. Andrew Johnson now becomes president of the United States. Johnson, a Democrat, Johnson, a Southerner, Johnson from the state of Tennessee. Keep in mind, in the election of 1864, when Lincoln ran for re-election, he didn't think he was going to win. And there's a lot to say about that. Letters that he had his cabinet sign saying that when we lose, we still promise to pursue the Civil War to its final stages in the hopes of ending the war with a victory. Lincoln was saved by his military, both in terms of victories in Atlanta and other areas, and of course by the Union Army voting on something called absentee ballots. Do you hear that, President Trump? Uh, where most of them voted for their commander in chief. But now it's Johnson who is in his shoes, as with any president who follows somebody that's great. Uh, Look at John Adams coming after George Washington. Look at Martin Van Buren, who followed the highly revered Andrew Jackson. Um, Small feet to fill some big shoes. And Johnson had the biggest shoes of all to fill. He's going to pursue Lincoln's plan, but with an even more mild approach. What he argued was that to come back into the Union, the states were going to have to accept the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to what were now the freedmen. Andrew Johnson, a different guy. He too is going to believe in presidential pardons, but he does not go as far as Lincoln did. Lincoln, of course, excluded certain people from seeking pardons. Johnson did not. Johnson came from, if you will, the other side of the tracks. Johnson was poor. Johnson was also poorly educated, had built up an animosity toward the wealthy, the well-to-do class, which of course were primarily planters and slaveholders. But he was also a racist, and he was Southerner through and through. So Johnson, in lording his power over those who used to lord it over him, said, no, you guys can come back into the Union as full participating citizens, but you must personally ask me for a pardon. Well, people claim that the lines went around the block as individuals came to the White House, many of them women begging for pardons for their husbands or their sons. Johnson did not have the personal appeal of Lincoln and did not have the political wherewithal to maneuver Congress as Lincoln did. There was his statement: the Constitution as it is, the country as it was. The country as it was. He, of course, had no connection to the 4.5 million people who are now totally free as a result of the 13th Amendment. And Johnson was not going to enforce any of their rights. Johnson is going to veto the following bills: the Freedmen's Bureau, which was up for rechartering, Civil Rights Acts of 1866, 1867, which we'll talk about later in terms of what they did, and the Tenure of Office Act. This was an attempt by Congress to outmaneuver the president. The Tenure of Office Act said that the president could not fire any cabinet member without the approval of Congress. Now, he could not hire a cabinet member without the approval of Congress. Now, of course, Trump has managed to bypass that when he makes these people acting heads. They're just temporary. So he avoids having approval of Congress. Congress was going to make sure that this doesn't happen with the Tenure of Office Act, which, of course, quite honestly, was unconstitutional. And that was the reason that Johnson gave for vetoing it. However, it is not up to him to decide constitutionality. So that was not legal on his part. So what does Congress do? Do they disagree with vehemently time and time again? It's impeachment time. So they are going to bring impeachment charges against Andrew Johnson. As you know from what we went through with Trump, the House of Representatives is the one who impeaches. Keep in mind, to be impeached means that you are formally indicted by Congress. It does not mean that you've been found guilty. So Johnson was the first president impeached. He was indicted. Later, of course, Clinton, and of course, most recently, Trump. Then it goes to the United States Senate. It is presided over by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and then, of course, the Senate serves as the jury, if you will. You need a 2/3 majority to impeach. They charge him with violating the Tenure of Office Act. They charged him with using blue language. In other words, he cursed. They claimed that his vetoes of the various and sundry bills were unconstitutional and in violation. Now, of course, they weren't, but that's what they're charging him with. And that was, of course, the real reason for impeachment. They politically disagreed, so they wanted to get rid of him. And that, of course, is what many of Trump's supporters argued. And quite honestly, when Clinton was impeached, it was the same argument. This was a political thing with no real basis for a trial. He tried to fire Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Stanton was, of course, a Lincoln holdover. Stanton, as Lincoln oftentimes referred to him as, his god of war. Stanton was all for punishing the South. And oftentimes Stanton, quite honestly, deserved to be fired. Could have easily been fired under Lincoln for various insults and disobeying some of Lincoln's edicts. But definitely, he did not follow through on some of the orders issued by the president. Stanton was fired, replaced by Ulysses S. Grant for a short period of time. We'll talk more about that in a couple of minutes. And finally, by a gentleman by the name of George Thomas. So that's the basis. They will miss impeaching Johnson by one vote. One vote. A senator from Kansas, Republican, who commits political suicide, recognizes that this was purely political and votes the other way. And that's the one vote that they missed by. A gentleman by the name of Edmund Ross, who will be the subject later on of a Pulitzer Prize winning book by soon-to-be President John F. Kennedy. So Johnson remains as president until 1868, but essentially he's an empty suit. He has no power. Congress has stripped him of all respect, and he will just fill out his time. Now, you can see the war between Congress and Johnson. He refuses to accept the states of Colorado and Nebraska. He vetoes the Refugees Act, which of course dealt with the Freedmen's Bureau, Tenure of Office Act. He wants all property that was seized by the Union to be given back to the plantation owners. He will not allow disabled soldiers to serve as managers for various aspects of Reconstruction in the South. All right, 41 total vetoes. As you see there, that's more than all previous presidents combined. So his fights with Congress, as you see there, obviously the South now believes he does stand with them, that he is a true Southerner. And as a result of what they perceive to be the help and the protection of the presidency, violence in the South dramatically increases. You could make the same argument today with some of Trump's statements in regards to white supremacist groups and others like them. Violence and hate crimes have shot through the roof since then. But the social and political violence that would take place now at the end of the Civil War is unparalleled in our history. Take a close look at this advertisement. The Freedmen's Bureau, an agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man, twice vetoed by the president and made law by Congress. Support Congress and you support the Negro, sustain the president and you protect the white man. I want you to take a close look at that. And what you will see is that this was published in Pennsylvania. This isn't down south. This is in Pennsylvania. So what now goes on in the South? You're going to have a series of laws passed called the Black Codes. Those codes or laws essentially were meant to bind the freedmen to the land that they had been slaves on and essentially make them slaves. At the same time, you'll have the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. We'll talk more about them shortly. The Klan, through intimidation and through violence, through murder and through beatings and torture, they are going to attempt to enforce those black codes. And as Johnson had said earlier, to go back to the way things were. Many of the former Confederate politicians and generals, all responsible for treasonous behavior, will be reelected to the United States Senate. One of them, Alexander Stephens from South Carolina, Stephens was the vice president of the Confederacy. Now he's back in Congress and demands that he be given his old committee chairmanship back. Demands it. December 24th, 1865. You're going to see that there would be violence in New Orleans. During that day, there would be Christmas Eve, keep in mind, right? 34 freedmen killed, 200 wounded. On that same day, in Memphis, over 100 blacks would be massacred. In Mississippi during this time period, as you see down there, they authorized the sale of black orphans. Well, now, think about it. You're sitting in Congress, you're a Northern senator, a Northern member of the House of Representatives, and you're looking at slavery existing in the South again. Same Confederate guys right back in power again, and the violence that's taking place as if they had won the war. What would you think? The Klan would rise all over the South. It initially was the brainchild of the man you see on that statue, a statue that was located in Pulaski, Tennessee. That man, of course, would be responsible for the rise of the Klan. He had been a Confederate cavalryman, claimed that this was simply a social organization, and later would leave it. However, all right, that statue would stand until recently, and that brings up, of course, the controversy over all the statues which existed down south. Most of them put up after Reconstruction ended, and it was a symbol in many instances to the newly freed slaves that things were going to go back to the way they were, and of course, a symbol of white dominance. The position, of course, was subservience. The Black Codes. Again, laws intended to keep them working on the plantations. You could not go out at night without a pass from the owner of the plantation. Uh, if you were found to be unemployed, then you would be arrested for loitering or vagrancy and then sold to an individual plantation owner to provide labor. Well, that, of course, is slavery. The radical Republicans mean to put an end to this. They wanted total control. Now, you see this political cartoon. Sitting atop of it is a character that looks a bit like Napoleon, and you look at the initials AJ, and that, of course, is Andrew Johnson. All right. You'll see the two Union soldiers with their bayonets propping up what is known as a carpetbag government. And this was called bayonet rule. Now, of course, this was not true. It was a total exaggeration by the South. Uh, there were only a total in the entire South of around 30,000 Union soldiers. And when you take a look at the immensity, the geographic immensity of the South, how could 30,000 soldiers quite possibly prop up any of these governments and enforce any of the laws? So this was a total myth. Stevens and Sumner, of course, are the ones leading it. There would be a number of tactics that the radical Republicans would use to keep themselves in power. One of them would be waving the bloody shirt. In elections, where candidates sometimes would share the same stage, after the Democratic candidate would speak, the Republican candidate would stand up, take a shirt that appeared to be soaked in blood, and would start waving it. The implication being that all Democrats were disloyal to the Union, and it was they who were responsible for the hundreds of thousands of Union deaths and people that had been crippled as a result of the war. And that tactic alone was good to ensure them victories in many of the political races across the country. The South referred to people who were down south, those who supported the North, as carpetbaggers and scalawags. Carpetbaggers, and you see that carpet bag portrayed in the cartoon. Carpetbaggers got their name from people who decided to, in this particular case, go down south and seek their fortunes. Many of them were genuine in their desire to help the freedmen or to reconstruct the South. Many of them were also genuine in going down to make their fortunes on the backs of anybody they could. And a lot of them came carrying bags made from their mother's carpets, in which they sewed them together, put handles on them, and threw their belongings in them. Hence the nickname carpetbaggers. Scalawags were Southerners who would go over to the northern controlled governments. One of them being James Longstreet. Longstreet, of course, Lee's old war dog, or war horse as he referred to him. He went over to the Republican Party and tried to convince the Southerners that if you can't beat them, join them so that you can control the narrative. And of course, they would pass, we're talking about Republican control of Congress, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, known as the Civil War Amendments, the end of slavery, citizenship, and then finally the right to vote. Now, one of the things coming out of all of the stuff that we see happening in the South at the conclusion of the war would be the South divided up into military districts, which would be ruled by generals. And when those generals had decided that each of those districts had met the qualifications to come back into the Union, then they would be readmitted based on a vote within the individual states or the individual districts. Now, as you see with this political cartoon, waving the bloody shirt and holding the South, and particularly the Democratic Party, responsible for the Civil War, becomes quite a tactic. As you see in the cartoon there, the ghost of a Union soldier died for the Union, died for the Union. You see the various battles, Gettysburg, Atlanta, Richmond, Andersonville, etc. And there is the Copperhead snake, which of course stood for many of the people who were for peace in the Democratic Party. I'm going to skip that. Now, laws that were passed under radical Reconstruction. The Civil Rights Act, vetoed, of course, by Johnson, okay? This was to give equal protection under the laws, specifically to the newly freed slaves. The 14th Amendment, citizenship, and again, equal protection for everyone under the law. The Reconstruction Act of 1867, which was going to give the newly freed slaves the right to vote. That would be, of course, enshrined in the 15th Amendment. And then, of course, there was the Civil Rights Act of 1875, saying that they could not be discriminated against in public accommodations. So restaurants, means of transportation, etc., all would have to give equal protection. Was this successful? In many instances, yes. You see pictures there of individual congressmen, one of them being Hiram Revels, the first black man elected to the United States Senate. In many of the state governments, you're going to have, for example, in South Carolina, in which the majority of the citizens were black, you're going to have slightly over 50% of the state House of Representatives were black at that particular time. And that was around 1867. One of the economic things that's going to result at the end of the Civil War would be something called sharecropping. Many of the plantation owners, of course, saw that they could not maintain what they had previously. Here in Georgia, you have the Barrow plantation. He had, at one point in time, I believe, over 400 slaves. And that was the size of his plantation. But now, end of the Civil War, he has no slaves. So what he did was, and what many people did was, and unfortunately in certain respects it was legal, they would rent out living quarters and land. The idea being, you're now a tenant on my former land, and the rent will be a share of the profits that you get from selling your crops. And this is the way that cotton and other crops would be harvested and sold. Now, problem was that the rent, if you will, was extremely high. And if you could not afford to pay it, well, that just meant that there was interest. So that kept getting pushed up and up, which meant you became, if you will, a land slave. You were a slave to the land, and you couldn't leave until you paid your debt. And then, of course, again, to get started, you needed seeds for crops. You needed certain farm implements, all of which would be sold to you or rented to you by the owner of the land. Segregation is going to start running rampant down south. And of course, in 1898, the infamous Supreme Court decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, which would rule that you can have separate and equal facilities. This is going to last until 1954, with the first of many Supreme Court decisions. This is the most famous, Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, which of course said that schools could not be segregated. Election of 1868, Ulysses S. Grant. Grant, of course, a military hero, at least on the Union side of the Civil War. Grant, uh, many people consider to be one of the worst presidents in the history of the United States. And in certain respects, you can understand that. Scandals abounded his administration, none of which he was involved in any way, shape, form, or fashion. His greatest weakness was he trusted people and didn't do a good job of vetting them. However, Grant was not going to put up with the violence down south. He was not going to put up with the uh, rise of the Ku Klux Klan. And he truly believed, as time went on, in Black equality. So he was the best friend that the ex-slaves had. And in office, he did quite a bit to live up to that. But the various and sundry scandals, the Belknap scandal, Secretary of the Interior was receiving bribes in order to defraud the Indians of land and money. Um, the biggest scandal, the one that was going to get the most publicity, would be the Credit Mobilier scandal. And I'll talk more about that when we talk about the rise of big business. But again, scandal after scandal. However, when he ran for re-election in 1872, despite all this, he gets reelected. Listen closely. Now, that of course was the Southern anthem. So you can understand why there were people who believed that, as the radical Republicans did, that Reconstruction should take a rather harsh turn, if you will. And of course, when we talk about the controversy surrounding the statues, the flying of the Confederate flag, etc., keep some of that in mind. Well, Grant finishes his second term and is finished as president in his mind. That brings up the election of 1876, perhaps the most controversial election. Of course, we haven't seen this one yet in American history. And it will be the most corrupt one. And once again, as in many of the controversial elections, the election of 2000 being one of them, all right, Florida is going to hold the key. Florida is, of course, a Democratic state. And initially, it looks like it goes for the Democratic candidate, who's from the state of New York, by the way, Samuel Tilden. He's running against the Republican nominee, Rutherford B. Hayes, a former Civil War general. Well, all of a sudden, Florida says, oh, wait a minute. Those guys, the electors, are not the real electors in the state. And then you have a couple of other states saying the same thing. So the election is up in the air. They can't reach a decision. So they put together a joint committee of Congress, the House of Representatives, the Senate, and a member of the Supreme Court. All told, 15. The Supreme Court guy is supposed to be neutral. Well, he dies. Somebody else is appointed who happens to be a Republican. And as you see, all the votes, I said 15, I'm sorry, 9 votes. All the votes, 5-4 in favor of the Republicans, which means, of course, the election goes to Hayes. Well, as you can imagine, the South is furious and they are threatening another civil war. As a result, you're going to have the Compromise of 1877. This is going to be between Republicans and Democrats, and essentially between North and South. What the Compromise of 1877 says was, okay, Hayes is president. By the way, there was an attempted assassination of Hayes. He's standing at his bathroom mirror trying to shave, and a bullet comes through the bathroom window and nearly gets him. This is while he's in Ohio. He has not yet made his way to Washington, D.C. But in return for Hayes winning, all military of the United States is to be pulled out of the South. And Congress is going to promise to not interfere with segregation in the South. So the Republican Party, which owed its dominance early on to the votes, if you will, of the freedmen, which had pushed through the Emancipation Proclamation and the 3 Civil War amendments, they now abandon them. Most freedmen will stay with the Republican Party until FDR comes along in 1933. And that's when they will make the switch over to the Democratic Party. But this essentially, the Compromise of 1877, was the end of Reconstruction. With the promise of Congress not to interfere and with the withdrawal of military troops, the South was free to do what it wished to. Now, what did it wish to do? Take a look at this. You have something known as the lost cause. And the lost cause is a tale, a fantasy that was spun by supporters of the Confederacy. And in it, they tried to say that the war was not about slavery, that the only reason that the North won was because they had more men and more stuff, that the South was just like the colonies in their revolution for independence and the American Revolution, and that the slaves were happy. Take a look, for example, at some of the quotes here. Jubal A. Early, who was prominent during the Battle of Gettysburg, saying slavery furnished a class of laborers as happy and as contented as any in the world. Go down to the next one there in yellow, from the Southern Quarterly Review in 1861. The North has been the attacking party. South fired the first shots. The South has stood on defense. Not true. Then Edmund Ruffin, who will later commit suicide at the end of the war because he could not stand to live among Yankees. He says, this war was the result of assaults of the North on the population of the South, and We're defending our rights at all hazards, just as those of the patriotic party in the colonies from 75 to 76 done. All right. Again, take a look at the quote following that from the Richmond Dispatch newspaper. The present war waged by the Yankees against the states is for the same object, slavery. And then there's Vice President Alexander Stevens, declared that white Southerners had consistently sought that liberty and equality established by the Constitution had periled their lives to establish. Of course, liberty and equality did not apply to slaves. The lost cause that still exists today, it's going to become almost universally accepted for quite some time. Dominates the history books for a lot of different reasons. And it is a result, in many instances, of the North just tiring of the war, the North tiring of the struggle down South, and just to let it go and let's move on. But as a result of the Compromise of 1877, you'll see this. Poll taxes were instituted, that if you wished to vote, you had to pay a tax. And of course, there was something called the grandfather clause. In other words, if your grandfather didn't pay taxes to vote, then you didn't. Well, of course, that didn't apply to any freedmen because their grandfathers had been slaves. And so therefore they had to pay the taxes. And of course, they couldn't afford to. So that eliminated voting. You'll have literacy tests. And in the literacy test, some obscure passage of some obscure document would be printed. You had to correctly interpret it. And again, if you didn't, you couldn't vote. And again, grandfather clause established that if your grandfather voted, you didn't have to take a literacy test. But there were other ways, of course, that intimidated people from voting. Violence was on a rise. The Confederate cavalry leader who had started the Ku Klux Klan, Nathan Bedford Forrest, he himself saw how violent everything was becoming, and he withdrew from the Klan. But he's the one that started it, and he's the one that helped it get going. This is what you'll see throughout the South. The lynchings that take place between 1890 and 1920. You have somewhere in the neighborhood of 12,000 lynchings, and never once was anybody convicted for those crimes. Never once. So through intimidation, matter of fact, one Northern congressman in the 1880s, this is after the Compromise of 1877, obviously, receives an envelope. He opens it up, and there was a black finger in the envelope with a letter signed. It wasn't anonymous, it was signed. And it said in the letter, "This is what happens to them that tries to vote." So this is how the Democratic Party in the Confederacy managed to keep and maintain control. Well, that takes us through Reconstruction. I am going to set up office hours after this. If you have any questions, anything you'd like to discuss, I'll be available in the conference module on Canvas. Any problems, please don't hesitate to email me, and we'll try to take care of them as soon as possible.